Most of us know of Judas as the betrayer of Jesus, the one disciple who essentially stabbed him in the back and sold him out, for 30 pieces of silver, no less. His name is not one that evokes any sense of pride or humility, but rather can be thrown around as an insult to insinuate treachery, deception, and low moral character. As far as the biblical account goes, Judas simply isn't a very good person, and whilst he is naturally vilified and detested, betrayal and disloyalty are as far as his characteristics go. So why am I talking about Judas being a vampire? Well, during my research for new topics to talk about, I stumbled upon an early 20th century text known as The Vampire, His Kith and Kin, by English author and clergyman Montague Summers, which tells us of various mythology and folklore surrounding the phenomena of the vampire. In one particular legend, Summers speaks of a somewhat secretive cult living in the regions of Serbia and Romania, who styled themselves as actual vampires under the nom de guerre, the Children of Judas. Supposedly, these individuals had descended from a vampiric bloodline that traced its way all the way back to Judas himself. But unlike Judas, these people were arguably even fouler, for they would drain their victims of blood with a bite or a kiss. Upon first reading this, I automatically assumed that these Children of Judas, if such a people really existed, merely chose their name for shock value, and as a means to exemplify their own debaucherous characteristics by associating themselves with the betrayer of Christ. After all, there is no indication in the Bible that Judas was a vampire, nor that he had any children, so at best, this nom de guerre made very little sense. However, it wasn't until recently that I stumbled upon the whispers of another text, a supposed 9th century text believed to have been written in Aramaic, the language thought to have been spoken by Jesus Christ. Did I start to consider the credence of the Children of Judas. This text, known as the Book of Alugah, was said to have been written by a Catholic monk by the name of Aid. Unfortunately for us, this text is notoriously hard to find. In fact, I'm even dubious as to whether it really exists. A quick search online will net you with some articles highlighting that Judas appears to be made into a vampire as punishment for his deception, but none of these are able to quote directly from the book, nor give a broader assessment as to what the book is really about. With that in mind, it's more than likely that the book itself is probably a really niche internet hoax that never really took off. But it is alarming to see the amount of articles online that source the Book of Alugah as a legitimate text. With this, the book itself has generated a mythology of its own, with some debating its existence at all, and others questioning the context of which Judas apparently becomes a living vampire. It must be said that God turning Judas into a vampire is pretty random. I can understand him wanting to punish Judas by making him wander the earth, similar to Cain's punishment, or even the punishment of the Wandering Jew, found in medieval legends, but incorporating the vampiric aspects reeks of YA fantasy. If the concept at all sounds familiar, it is because it's also the plot for the movie Dracula 2000, where Judas is basically cursed by God into becoming Dracula after failing to hang himself. Seems legit. In any case, with what little source material we have to put this episode together, let's explore this idea of Judas being a vampire and see what parallels we can establish between the elusive Book of Alugah and scripture itself. As we know from chapter 27 of the Gospel of Matthew, after Judas betrays Jesus and Jesus is delivered to Pontius Pilate, Judas begins to feel bad about the whole thing. When he saw that Jesus was to be condemned, he repented and brought to the chief priests and elders the 30 pieces of silver which he was paid to deliver Jesus to them. In effect, Judas was attempting to alleviate his conscience by giving back the blood money that he'd accepted. However, the chief priests and elders give him no such reprieve, and instead tell him that it's really not their problem, but his own burden to carry. To this, we see Judas cast down the pieces of silver in the temple, and resolved in that moment to take his leave and hang himself. This is the last we hear or see of Judas in the Bible. We aren't told where he took his own life, what happened to his body, nor any of the supernatural occurrences nor stories that pertain to Judas receiving any sort of comeuppance beyond death. Judas is simply shuffled off the mortal coil, and that's the end of it. So where the concept of him becoming a vampire comes from is pretty hard to say. The Book of Alugah, as far as online articles are concerned, is fairly explicit in determining that Judas became a vampire after he took his own life, for God was so angry at him for his deceptiveness that he cursed him with this burden. Again, as no reliable source actually read this book, it should for the time being be taken with a grain of salt. In any case, the supposed sentiment behind the narrative is that God told Judas that he would fear the sun and the light of day, and that because of this, he was limited to roaming in the night. Accounts continue that Judas was told by God that the only way he could sustain himself was through the blood of living humans, and that this was the only thing that Judas would be allowed to feed on again. Furthermore, one account I read goes as far as to say that God knew that Judas would have offspring, and that they too would be cursed in the same way, creatures of the night that could feed only on blood. Lastly, another sentiment that comes out of these accounts of the Book of Alugah is that silver, the cross, and Christians themselves would automatically become an aversion to Judas. With this, it might be tempting here to draw upon later vampiric myths and traditions, and assign them to this account to give it validity, such as silver being used to harm vampires, or crucifixes being used to ward them away. Some attempt to justify the concept by suggesting that because Judas was paid in silver, and because Judas was so desperate to be rid of the silver thereafter, silver then became a means to repel all things wicked, including vampires. The same might be said of the crucifix, which in modern traditions may be worn for protection, and even in the warding off of evil spirits. Because it was Judas that essentially put the wheels in motion for Jesus being crucified, it's understandable why some may believe that the crucifix can be then weaponized against him and his vampire ilk, for the crucifix would naturally be a grim reminder of the dark deed that haunted him. There are some other factors that may have swayed some believers into considering that Judas might very well have been a vampire, despite there being no indication of this in the Bible. For one, there did exist a superstition in Catholic and Jewish traditions that Judas possessed red hair. Alone, this isn't really that big of a deal, but combined with an earlier superstition that red-haired people were unmistakably vampires, according to the works of Montague Summers, we have ourselves a slightly more adequate argument, though one that still falls apart in the face of actual scripture. Another idea that can be reinforced by Summers' vampire His Kith and Kin is that it was once believed that suicides led to the deceased becoming vampires in the afterlife. That is to say, they rose from the grave and lived restlessly thereafter in the physical world. If we were to apply this logic to Judas's death, then by all means, Judas would very well be eligible for the vampire role. However, there are some glaring issues with the Book of Alugah beyond its authenticity. The actual narrative that Judas becomes a vampire and has vampire children isn't just a far cry from the Gospel of Matthew, but it comes with some inconceivable notions that simply cannot be reconciled with the traditional canon, nor with the motives of a traditional biblical God. For example, why would God make Judas and his offspring vampires when their sole essence of survival comes at the cost of innocent people's blood? Instead of punishing Judas, it almost seems as if God has enabled him to continue doing bad things. Not only is Judas immortalized, granted, it is understood that he will crave for normality, but he is also turned into what is essentially a mass-murdering monster. The closest comparison we have to this is when God curses Cain to wander the earth, but even then, Cain isn't made into something else other than what he is, and his continued existence doesn't appear to come at the detriment to anyone else. The account from the Book of Alugah attempts to frame Judas as the very first vampire, but this comes with its own set of problems. Vampirism existed as far back as Babylonian times, just not necessarily as we know it today, nor as the accounts of the Book of Alugah attempt to describe it. In Babylon, for example, evil spirits known as Lulutu were believed to drink the blood of newborns and infants, and whilst these creatures were considered to be night demons, they were not necessarily confined to the darkness, nor appear to have been warded off by silver. In ancient Greece, meanwhile, there existed the Lamia, a monstrous woman who also preyed on children by drinking their blood. Both creatures, whether considered superstition or otherwise, would have predated Christ, meaning that Judas could not have been the first vampire anyway. You might argue that he was the first New Age vampire, one that we are more familiar with today, but even these tropes weren't traditionally mainstreamed until the 19th century, with Bram Stoker's Dracula. Lastly, the cursing of bloodlines doesn't tie into what the biblical God has outlined in the Bible. Put simply, whilst it is not beyond God to do something like this, we do see him lay down some heavy consequences after all. We never see him curse a person's entire bloodline, as indicated in the accounts purporting to the Book of Alugah. Several communities believe that the bloodline of Cain was cursed, for instance, and that all of Cain's descendants would be descendants who were inherently evil. But we know from the Bible that Cain's descendants were mostly contributors to society, with the likes of Jabal pioneering in agriculture, Jubal creating music, and Tubal-Cain being credited as establishing smithwork. So it's reasonable to believe in that instance that God did not curse Cain's bloodline, much in the same way that he probably wouldn't have cursed Judas's bloodline either, even if he did prolong his existence as a living vampire. We can even reinforce this claim that God would not have cursed Judas's bloodline by referring to chapter 18 of Ezekiel, where God speaks, "The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him." Without an authentic verified copy of the elusive Book of Alugah, nor any credible information of the Catholic monk Aid, who supposedly wrote it, it's really quite difficult to consider it sensibly. At best, it comes off like fanfiction, and as others will surely point out, it does sound suspiciously similar to the movie Dracula 2000, with Judas essentially becoming a vampire as punishment for his involvement in murdering the Messiah. In any case, if you have any thoughts or ideas, then be sure to let me know in the comments below. As always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.